but let's go ahead and kick this off. This week, we're going to be talking about identity governance in Microsoft hybrid environments. Once again, you get to listen to Chris Lloyd, our principal architect, who has done a phenomenal job putting this presentation together. Before we get started with it, though, I want to spend just a few moments talking about Oxford Computer Group's path towards identity governance. We've been working with identity now for going on, 17 years. And in the past several years, we've had a number of customers come back to us and say, hey, you guys offer great services, but what do you do on the governance side? And we've had to expand our offering on the governance side considerably in order to meet the demand out there in our enterprise accounts. And I bring up enterprise for a specific reason. The first thing that we realize when dealing with governance in an enterprise account is that you have to be agnostic about what you're dealing with. Governance has to cover everything in an IT environment in large customers. And we'll be touching on that throughout this webinar. But the other thing that we know is in just about 100% of our customer base, AD exists very broadly, both on-prem and in the cloud. Obviously, increasingly, people are moving things into the cloud. So AD has to be part and parcel of the conversation that we have with enterprise customers. And we've attempted in this webinar to keep the focus somewhat on the AD side of things, but also to give you a flavor of how solutions need to accommodate the broader infrastructure that we find in our large accounts. So I'm not going to add any more to that. I'm just going to turn it over to Chris Lloyd and let him kick this off.
Well, thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Lloyd, the Principal Architect at Oxford Computer Group. Just going to go through some quick housekeeping items here for the webinar. We're going to last about 60 minutes. And please submit your questions through the console there, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. And then we're going to record this webinar for future viewings and email you a link. So who is OCG, if you haven't heard of us? We're identity management consulting company. We do planning and assessments. We have deployment services, and we also offer managed services. We've been a partner of the year for many years out of the past several years, and we have deep connections with the Microsoft Cloud engineering team. Having said that, we're going to be focusing on some of Microsoft's technologies with this webinar, as well as Saviynt technology, which is our partner in the governance space. And I want to kick right off into what is identity governance. And historically, identity management has focused on the basics of user provisioning, password management, and or synchronization of identities, essentially building a meta directory of identity information. Just because that's the first building block on my slide doesn't exactly mean that we have achieved that in full, by no means. Organizations are always adding new applications, and there's always those legacy applications without an easy API that are generally thorns in our side, or we figure out a way around them. And identity management started to pivot towards security and compliance when identity governance was introduced. Certifications and reporting are key for passing regulatory audits. And role management was the goal that all of us wanted to achieve, but our tool sets that we used to get there were a bit cumbersome to manage effectively. And so that kind of brings me to one of the main points of this presentation is we're going to be talking a lot about identity analytics. And our ever-evolving identity landscape has changed yet again. So, we live in a hybrid identity state with 1 foot on-premise and 1 foot in the cloud. But we can use these identity analytics to look deeper into these apps to see how users are actually using their entitlements. And we can use this data for security purposes and identity needs. And continuous monitoring of these applications and identities and how they're using those apps is extremely important in maintaining compliance across an organization. And so identity analytics can be kind of bucketed into 3 different categories. We have visibility, which provides us a window into how data and identities are being used. It's usually in the form of reporting, and some of us have been in that room when someone asks for a report of all the users and what they have access to, and usually a couple of people in the room's eyes get big because they historically that has not been an easy report to generate. The second bucket is governance, and it's really the enforcement of segregation of duties, access certifications, and role management. And then security is the last bucket. It's kind of a twofold bucket here. There's the discovery side of security, where we need to discover risky users, sensitive data, where it is, who's accessing it, privileged users, and we need to detect threats. And then there is the enforcement side, where we need to revoke access and take action on threats or quarantine files. So I'm going to jump right into what the offerings are that Microsoft has. And Microsoft's identity analytics offerings are tightly focused around the Microsoft stack. Who would have guessed? But they have made some endeavors into software as a service applications. And a lot of their items in their stack are very heavily focused on authentication events. There are some items in here that do focus on the data and how it's being used, but the majority of Microsoft's offerings in identity analytics are focused on authentication events. And so that brings us to Azure Identity Protection. This is a very interesting service from Microsoft, leveraging its massive footprint on how many different users they have in Azure Active Directory and how many authentication events they are processing, in addition to their investments in cybercrime and looking at everything in a mass scale. And so they're basically able to take what they've learned and seen, and this actually comes from the Xbox Live side of the house, but they're able to take that into risk score users using, again, identity analytics to figure out, who are the risky users. Have they gone to do impossible travel? Are there leaked credentials that they may have picked up on the black market? Are there suspicious sign-in activities? And really taking that into account, giving users a risk score, and then allowing you to put policies around what needs to happen when a user has a certain risk score. Do we challenge them with MFA? Do we force a password reset? And so all sorts of different things can be triggered upon this data that they're amassing. The second, another offering that they have that uses identity analytics is the Azure Advanced Threat Protection. It's still in existence as Advanced Threat Analytics, which is an on-premise version of this, but they lifted this to the cloud recently. And so it's basically the same premise as ATA, but what it's doing is it's meant to detect vulnerabilities, malicious attacks, and abnormal behavior for on-premise identities. It's all based around Active Directory authentication, and so that's where all this data and analysis is being done. And so now it can be done in the cloud. It is flying under the name of the Advanced Threat Protection. So if you're familiar with the Microsoft naming standard, they're going to have Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. There's an Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. These are starting to talk to one another, but we fully expect them to continue that enrichment of a security dashboard and security analytics with merging of these products to have them pass information back and forth to each other. This one is I consider it a fairly, no-brain. It's exactly what you would want to put in your environment. It detects stuff. It gives you a very detailed analysis of where the attacks are coming from. It's not that complicated to put in an environment, and I would suggest, if you have the Enterprise Civility Suite, seriously considering putting this in. Microsoft's Cloud App Security it's a CASB, which is essentially allows you to look at different SaaS applications and the events that are happening inside of those applications. Obviously, Office 365 is their in-house SaaS app that they have, so naturally this is going to tie in with that. But it allows the hooks to go in there, and it's all dependent upon the API that the service provides. But if you're looking at, let's say, Office 365, for example, you're able to look at the files that users are sharing, opening, using, how they're sharing them. It does tie in with Azure Information Protection, which is the classification and protection of documents. It ties in with those labels, allowing you to create your own policies around how data can traverse through the environment, whether it can be shared externally or who's actually gaining access to it. It also does look at login events, so we're able to pull in login events from these different services to look for malicious activity. We have a concept or a product offering called Fish Hunter, which uses this to remediate and to prevent the ill effects of a successful phishing attack. So users' credentials have already been compromised by a phishing attack, but we use this to then lock down that account after we've detected that anomaly. And that brings us to Savient's identity analytics. And Saviynt has a much more agnostic view of their tool set. They will connect to almost anything to either pull in data, provision accounts, retrieve security information. Their focus areas are both on-premise and in the cloud, and they really do take a holistic view of identity in the enterprise. They will interface quite seamlessly with Microsoft's offerings, bringing them into their tool set as well. It does create a very good single pane of glass to view and use those identity analytics across the enterprise. And what we found here at Oxford, as we've been developing our service offering for governance, is to truly govern identities in your enterprise, you must be source agnostic. And so I've put this slide up here, and I'm focusing right now on the infrastructure access governance. I do want to do a quick poll here about what cloud platforms do you use as far as where you have infrastructure as a service. So if you wouldn't mind taking the time to just show which ones you're using. As you guys are filling out, as we're seeing that a lot of organizations are using multiple. It's not just a single place that they're actually going to leverage. All right, so we've got it's about as dispersed as I would have expected it to be. And so in having done that, said that and received that data, you have to have something that can connect into those different services, and that's where we find Saviynt. And we're specifically talking about infrastructure access governance. This is one of those things that we may not have traditionally brought into the identity space. But all of these things in the cloud, whether they be a virtual machine, a virtual network, they're all entitlements. And we manage entitlements by linking them to identities. And so we have to be able to provision access into those resources for users to be able to use them in those infrastructure services. On the flip side, everything in those cloud services has become accessible from an API. The configurations, so if we look at, let's say, a network security group in Azure, we can pull from the API, we can see what ports are open, we can see what resource groups or virtual machines it applies to. And being able to pull all that in along with the identity data allows us to really create an area where we can analyze stuff against known good configurations. And actually, Saviynt has about 250 different controls pre-built into their software that will go through and either look through like something like AWS or Azure and look for machine configurations or platform as a service configurations if you're thinking of SQL databases or networking configurations, and look for risk and identify that risk, and allows you to go through and either say, oh, yeah, I accept that risk, we need that to be that way, and track that, because that's part of governance, is being able to say, this is my mitigating control for that feature, or that configuration. Or you can go remediate it and say, well, no, we need to do it, we need to apply our standards to that and not have that risk in our environment. And so that's just the infrastructure access governance side of Saviynt. There is also the data access governance, and this is kind of where Saviynt and Microsoft have some overlap because they both have a CASB component where they can both connect into those various SaaS offerings to really look at users and the data that they're interfacing with. Now, application access governance, this is where Saviynt really shines because we're able to connect to a wide variety of very system critical apps. So I've got there's two well-known EHRs up there. Oracle eBusiness is a beast, as well as SAP. And so managing access inside of those applications, through a single pane of glass and looking at entitlement hierarchies is really beneficial and can really assist with governance in the enterprise. I haven't talked about it, it's coming in a later slide deck, but Saviynt also does have segregation of duties for many of those applications that are out of the box. Now it's a great starting point, and they've identified exactly where those segregation of duties need to exist, but you can also customize them to meet your business needs. Now the last one we're starting to see a pickup in, which is external customer access governance. We're starting to see that with some B2C work that we've been doing in Azure AD, as well as some interesting things we're seeing with ForgeRock. A lot of the times those offerings, such as Azure B2C, is really just a directory. It's just a directory to store data. You're expected to build your application around it. Well, there's some needs that we're starting to see where we really do need identity and access management in front of that consumer directory. We might need identity proofing through something like LexisNexis. And so integrating Saviynt with that to do some identity proofing before we allow users access into systems and things like that. The bottom row here is really the basic list of the list of connectors for Saviynt is quite extensive. These are just some basic interfaces that Saviynt uses. As you see, there's 120 plus apps that it connects to. And so identity analytics, at its core, it's an identity management and governance engine. So we're pulling in HCM data that for joiners, movers, and leavers, processing them, and then that goes into the identity warehouse. And then using that identity as the foundation, obviously we can build upon that. So we have entitlements with roles and attribute-based access controls. And then we've got really the tie-in to the data. How are users accessing that data? How are they using those permissions inside of those applications? That's one of those things that we tend to we really haven't focused on in the past, where if we're giving users a permission that they're not using, should they actually have it? Do they need it? And so Saviynt can report on those things and make those suggestions. Again, it's all tied back into identity analytics. And so here's my 3-slide tutorial on governance. And I don't actually think this is 3 slides, it just sounded better with the number 3. And the things that we see in organizations are the desire to do role-based provisioning and access management. That's been a big item that I've spent a lot of time talking with a lot of organizations, and that's one of the things that they aspire to, and they're still constantly working. But they also face a lack of time to develop that role model. And they also have very big concerns about who does the role management, how many resources are needed to do that task, and who's the ultimate responsibility to manage those roles. And so here's how we can make identity governance painless. So just to set some foundational, a foundational premise here, this is a common scenario that we see. This may be more healthcare centric, but it applies across industries. On the left, we have a record of Workday and a credentialing record. For those of you not aware, a credentialing system at a hospital is what keeps tracks of all the providers, all their DEA numbers and MPI numbers, and a wide variety of other things that include their specialty. But this is very common in any organization where we have multiple sources of identity information that we need to combine in order to enhance our meta directory, our identity and access management system. We bring these in and we basically create a full-formed identity. And once we have this composite identity, we should leverage roles or attributes to drive provisioning access. You can see that here because you can see Terry is a physician in the ER with a template in Epic that's physician ER access. You'll also see that she's been given some groups in Active Directory that also are basically derivatives of that identity information. And that's really the RBAC, goal. And some of these may not have been roles, they may have been attribute-based access controls, which essentially is using attributes and using business logic to then grant access because we saw these attributes. And we've been doing that for quite some time now. But what we can do with bringing Saviynt into the picture here, along with Azure AD, is really enhance this process. So we have Azure AD can have criteria-based groups and app assignments in Azure. And Saviynt can complement the Azure AD side of the house while also governing all those applications that don't have connectors in Azure. And so how do we get there, right? So we use identity analytics. When we deploy Saviynt, we connect it to applications and consume all of that identity data, and we let it run for a set period of time. Once we've got that data, we can leverage it to suggest roles or attribute-based access control rules that will be used for provisioning. But before we take those suggestions, so Saviynt has provided us suggestions about what roles to make. Before we take them at face value, we'll want to do certifications on those roles with the app owners and the compliance departments. And that may sound like a large task, but we can configure those in Saviynt at a kind of micro certification level, where we either are attesting to high privileged access roles or a suggested role that we don't have a high confidence rating that it should exist. And so our goal with making these both ABAC and RBAC, because they're probably both going to exist, but our goal within this exercise is to hit like an 80% range. And it may not be 80% exactly, but our target rate is about 80% of provisioning can be achieved using RBAC and ABAC, and then that 20% is probably going to be done through a request process. And that request process should really be suggestive to the end user using identity analytics, meaning we're actually saying, okay, I see this user, Chris Lloyd, his peer group all has this access that he doesn't, and it wasn't on a role that we didn't give him. But we should, when he goes into request, we should say, hey, Chris, you should do this. Now, I may not be in there for that reason, but it was suggested to me, and I have the option of selecting, or I could go and do another selection just like we would in any other access request process. So that brings me to the fun part of segregation of duties. But these are compliance driven. So this is taking two permissions or multiple permissions that should not exist for a single user to have. A lot of these are defined either through auditory and compliance regulations, and a lot of them are very specific per application. So inside that application, there are permissions that a single user should not have together. But we should still have the ability to break those SODs for business requirements. But with that, we have to have the ability to break it. We have to let the user know that when they're requesting this access, that this is probably going to be a violation. It's probably going to be denied, but you can still request it. And if the business deems it necessary, that we have the proper mitigating controls and documentation to record that. So SODs aren't meant to be finite. They're meant to exist to remind people and to keep those permissions separate, but at the same time, we have to understand that the mission of the business has to allow us to break those rules, but in a confined way with mitigating controls. And so SOD management with Saviynt, we're able to achieve a holistic view of SODs rather than focus on a single application. Yes, those SODs for specific applications may exist, but we can expand that outside of that single application if we need to. Saviynt has many built-in SOD rule sets for many critical applications. I'm not going to read them off there, but they're right below that bullet. And then you can build your own SOD rule sets or modify the existing ones that came with Saviynt. And then we have the last one here, and this is really important when we're talking about SOC audits. where we're basically saying, well, if the user didn't really use that permission, what did it does it violate the control? It's almost like if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it. But because we're pulling in all that identity data from Saviynt, how the users are using, did they use that permission? We're actually able to pull that back into Saviynt and say, no, they didn't use that permission. At the same time, you can think about it as in, well, if that permission wasn't used on all the users who had it or the users who had a specific role, then an administrator within Saviynt would be notified to say, hey, you've given out this permission on this role, but nobody's using it. Why do they have it? And so that is also presented to the administrator. And so we have to use identity analytics as the driver. And we have to leverage peer group analysis to really truly understand the identities in our organization. We should use that as far as giving role recommendations. So if we take something like Oracle e-business suite, and I have a peer group, multiple people in the same department, and they all have the same access in Oracle e-business suite. Well, within Saviynt, we should have basically designated this is the Oracle e-business suite app owner. He can go in Saviynt or get notified via some notification method, whether it's an email or something else, that hey, you've got these users, they all have the same composite identity information. The Oracle e-business suite owner should be able to make a role and have that role suggested to him, and either say yes, that role exists, or no, we don't need that role. To flip that on the other side is, and I spoke about this earlier, but when a user comes in to request, we should equally be looking at their peer group to provide them suggestions on access. Not only does it make it easier on the end user to find what they're looking for, because a lot of organizations have a really large app catalog that if you go to a request process, and if we're doing an extensive amount of apps inside an IAM platform, recommending those can really speed up the process for the end user, and they usually, they can get what they need quicker with less confusion. All right, entitlement types. Now, I see this a lot, and I did not see it expressed very decently when I was thinking about this on when I did some research, and I tried my best here. So coarse-grained entitlements usually are a template or a role within an application. And I've taken Salesforce as an example because it's a high-value app. A lot of people have Salesforce, and I figure we could at least have that as a common plane of communication here. But Salesforce has a role, and underneath that role are all sorts of permissions. A lot of them come out of the box, but a Salesforce admin can modify them. Fine-grained permissions is the ability to not only see that role or set that role, but also look at and set all the different things underneath that role. So in Salesforce, there's permission sets, there's profiles, there's system permissions. It actually goes on and on, because within Saviynt, we could even drill down into the actual documents or content that they have access to. And so why does this matter? Because that Salesforce admin or somebody who has admin access to Salesforce can go and change that role, thereby affecting everybody who's been assigned that role. And that can be done well outside of any change control or any compliance organization saying that was the wrong thing to do. Because from the outside looking in, if I've an identity management administrator and I said, well, yeah, we're provisioning everybody with that marketing user role, it doesn't have this access. Well, that's not exactly, we don't know that for sure because we haven't read that additional fine-grained permissions back in, or we haven't provisioned with fine-grained permissions, so we don't really know what permissions the user has in the application. Additionally, for reporting needs, so back to when I started where we said, what access does the user have? Well, we know they have that role in Salesforce, but we really don't know much more than that, right? We can do some investigation, but if I want to pull a report and say, who has access to this content in Salesforce, I could easily do that with Saviynt because I pulled all those fine-grained permissions and entitlements in. And then we get visibility into the hierarchy of entitlements. Now, this may not apply to every single system that there is, but there are many systems that use a hierarchical organization of entitlements. And so actually viewing that in what we would consider a folder structure, but actually seeing those is quite beneficial. And the last thing about fine-grained control, and why does it matter, is the micro-certifications. So certifications have been around for quite some time, but micro-certifications are an attempt to reduce the fatigue of overly broad certifications of access. And so it's a flip to say we should only be attesting to the highly critical access that users have. And so if I can identify what the critical points are, I can do micro-certifications. And again, if you drill down into the fine-grained entitlements that exist, I now have more detail and better ability to really make those micro-certifications targeted. It brings me back to here, and I've added two things here. I've got Azure at the top and Saviynt at the bottom. Azure is really coarse-grained. So if you've ever set up Salesforce provisioning in Azure Active Directory, what your choices are is to pick roles for users. You basically do a group mapping exercise to Salesforce roles to Azure Active Directory groups. The scheme provisioning agent kicks off, and users get assigned that. In Saviynt, as I said before, we're able to really drill down into those permissions. We're able to do all the fine grain way below the, way beneath the role, and granularly look at those users' access. Not only are we setting that on the way out, but we're reading it back in. So if it changed, again, we're doing continuous reporting. And so why do we do all of this? Well, we do it for compliance reasons. We do it for legal reasons, security, but access reviews are definitely the closed loop, in the process of provisioning. Access requests have been important since we started this endeavor with identity and access management, but with further enhancements and further integrations, we are actually able to look at SLA violations. And you may be asking, what did you mean by that? And in effect, in Saviynt, there's the ability to do a disconnected app. There may be applications that we may never get a connector to. So that disconnected app will always be a manual provision or a manual modification. And so a user could come into Saviynt, request the access, Saviynt will go and alert the owner, put it in its queue, and then the owner was responsible for modifying the system, coming back into Saviynt and saying, yep, I did it. And so now that we're tracking that process, we're able to track a time frame between when a request was submitted to when it was actually processed. Now, we're able to do that because we're reading it back in from the system. So even though we may not have a connector to that system to actually automate the provisioning, we can set it up so a drop file from that application is done to read back in those permissions, those entitlements, all the different identity data from that application, read it back into Saviynt, and we can do a time correlation between when the request was submitted, when the app owner submitted, performed the action in the app, and then when we read it back in and perform some SLA violations if necessary. It's not exactly what this was designed to go out and do, but it's one of the things that we found that could be achieved with this. I talked about micro certifications, and then I didn't talk too much about usage login activity. I did in the Microsoft side, but we're really using identity analytics to figure out what users are doing, the logins to track how they're logging in, and the activity within those apps and what permissions or entitlements they're using. So auditors are looking at privileged accounts very closely, and in parentheses, and so do hackers. And when you're looking for a privileged access management tool set, and you may not, you may have multiples, and I'm going to kind of explain between our partnerships and what they do, but you should have least privileged identities in your environment. So identities should only have the privileges that they need to complete their jobs, and anytime they need to escalate that, they should go through a process to escalate that permission so they can perform that admin function and then reduce it back down to a least privileged state. That request process should include MFA. Most definitely it should include MFA. And approval workflows may be a requirement. They're not a necessity in some cases, because a lot of times we hire system administrators, and part of the system administrator's job is to elevate his access to go do system administrator things. So you may not want to put a workflow requirement because that's part of their job. the benefit of having them go through this process is that their account doesn't stay in a high privilege state the entire time. And so some of those tools, so getting back into the Microsoft and then the Saviynt focus, there's Azure AD PIM, which is Privileged Identity Management, which is solely focused around Azure Active Directory. We have used this internally, and I've helped many clients set this up. It's my duty to now tell you that you have too many too many global administrators in Azure AD. So just having said that, I feel like I've done my duty. And then there's MIM-PAM, which is solely focused on on-premise Active Directory. And that is basically the elevation of users into a group for a set period of time, and then removing that user from the group when that has expired. Saviynt has Firefighter Access, which is focused on the elevation of permissions to any application that Saviynt touches. That could be Active Directory, that could be Azure Active Directory, it could be Oracle E-Business Suite. But again, it's the elevation of those permissions and then removal of them once that time is expired. Now, Baumgar Lieberman, it takes a bit of a different approach. It still has the ability to, it's more of a checkout process. So there are service accounts or admin accounts that I need to check out, use, check back in, and the passwords are being rotated in the background for service accounts and those admin accounts. In addition to, since they've been acquired by Baumgar, they now have a pretty solid capture utility for screen capture with that product. So how do we plan for compliance? Well, so we have to identify the control points. You know, where are those control points? A lot of times that's sitting down with your audit team, figuring out what they are looking for. It's something that we've done where we've actually gone through different audits and looked at the controls, figure out where they map to identity, and establish those mitigating controls. Now, those may be with technology that we've been discussing today. And then, there's definitely going to be process. Process is a big part of compliance. Now, where those two intersect with technology and process, that's where we can really show value to the business. Auditors are always about evidence, so providing an auditor that evidence, whether it's via a report or a dump of data from this system, that's the evidence the auditors are needed to see. And so all that goes into documentation, whether it's the policies and processes or the technology, all needs to be documented so an auditor can put it into their system. And then we automate what we can. Attestation, reports, provisioning and deprovisioning, that's where we see value added. And that kind of brings me in a roundabout way to the Office 365 Compliance Manager. And this is a new tool set that Microsoft has added out into its service offering, but it is a dashboard that summarizes Microsoft's and your organization's control implementation progress for Office 365. And it does have different audits, whether it's GDPR or any of the ISO standards, and it is a nice tool set to go through and look at all the different controls that these frameworks have in them. It does allow you to put your implementation details in there. It also allows you to put your test plan, and sometimes it'll actually show you, say, oh, you can achieve this with this Microsoft technology, maybe from the Enterprise Mobility Suite, maybe it's built it natively into Office 365. You can assign these to various users so they can go work on them. And it's really just it's a dashboard that allows you to manage your audits in regards to Office 365. All right, and I think I've hit the end. The last thing I wanted to do was I wanted to get a poll out to say if you're interested in attending an in-person event about identity governance. And these are some of the ones that we already have scheduled at various places. And if you don't see a location near you, or if you pick other, I'm going to put up another poll after this one to show more locations that we are considering where to put an event. So I'll leave this one up for just a little bit longer, and if you'll bear with me. But while that's going, I don't know if we had any questions or not. I didn't see any. But you can also contact me via email or our Twitter or our LinkedIn or our Facebook. All right, I think I've got responses for that one. I'm going to close that poll, and then here are some other ones that have yet to be scheduled and places that we're considering to go do an in-person event to talk about this in much further detail.
And while you're answering that poll, I would suggest that now's a good time to start putting those questions in the question panel. And it has been a quiet group today. So, Chris, we've got a question about Saviynt versus SailPoint in the question panel. That's one that we hear all the time.
Yeah, so we looked at SailPoint when we were looking for a partner in the governance space, and we actually found that Saviynt with its various services, pretty much in the analytics space. Definitely when we're talking about identity analytics, we found that Saviynt had a strong edge over SailPoint in the identity analytics and the infrastructure governance side of things. At face value, they are both great identity governance platforms, but we felt that Saviynt had an edge over SailPoint in some certain areas, and that's why we decided.
Yeah, what we have seen over the years is in the more traditional way of doing role-based access control and the planning around it. It is very time-consuming, very labor-intensive, and it doesn't respond to the needs of a changing organization. When you take that, the approach that Saviynt has taken, which is to pull in all this data and analyze it and map it into basically a risk model and prioritize particular issues, that's the only way that you can keep up with all of the business requirements, the regulatory requirements, and the technical requirements. And Chris, there's another one. Oh, this is just the generic. Will you send over the PowerPoint after this meeting? We will be posting the recorded webinar for you, and the link to that will be going out. Any other questions? We still got a lot of people on the line. No? Going once? Going twice? Any more? All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this week. You'll see a lot more webinars on governance as we move forward. It's become a very important focus of Oxford Computer Group in the last 2 or 3 years. And we are seeing a lot of interest in automating the governance side of things from our client base as well. So thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you in our upcoming webinar series.